the splendor of 1,000 suns blazing all at once, resembling the exalted soul, is become death, the shatterer of worlds. That's the line from the Bhagavad Gita that Oppenheimer recalled when the first bomb, atomic bomb, was dropped on Hiroshima. And that happens to be on Scott Nearing's birthday.
Shit.
And every August 6th, we used to commemorate both Hiroshima and Scott's birthday. And he spoke at various occasions on those August 6th. And ironically, it also happens to be the theme of our next show, the Shatterer of Worlds Chapel, which is going on here and being rehearsed for this Friday, to open up on Friday and go on for a few Fridays.
Okay. Enough publicity for that.
Enough publicity, here comes the real introduction.
So, Scott Neary was my grandfather. We knew him from when we came to America from the Soviet Union. In '41, we'd visit Scott and Helen in their home in Jamaica, Vermont, which is where one of our speakers is living now, Greg. I remember the sugaring going on there, their beautiful house with no electricity, a hand pump in the kitchen, beautiful stone buildings that are still standing there. And then later, in my teenage years, I'd visit them often in Maine, and Scott had a really big influence on me. He took me to the stockyards in Chicago at a socialist conference when I was 16, and I became a vegetarian for the next 15 years. I recommend that trip to anybody who lives there. And just visiting him, being able to ask him questions, going to some of his lectures sometimes. When we lived in New York City in the 1960s, he had, I think, an 80th birthday with a big celebration. Oh, sorry. He had in New York City an 80th birthday where he did get a big audience in a big hall, but mostly starting in the 40s, 50s, until Living the Good Life was published, he was he was sort of blacklisted, and the New York Times wouldn't even accept a paid advertisement for his books. So his life was very, very multifaceted, and our two speakers are going to cover two aspects of his interesting life. I wanted to just, because I have them, read a couple of some paragraphs from Scott's letters to me when I was a teenager and asking him questions. I had heard that curiosity is a sign of intelligence, so I really asked a lot of questions when I was around him. And he was very, very practical, very patient, and very thorough. He would answer seriously, and he took me and anybody who asked him questions very seriously. And so this is a letter from 1951, and he says, I'd asked about a meal where we'd been with him, and he writes, I'm sorry for the liquor and the meat there. You know, he was a very strong vegetarian and anti-alcoholic. In principle, it's like going out to supper with cannibals and watching them eat flesh. As for the liquor, it is one of the most terrible curses in the USA today. There are now 3 million alcoholics in the USA, people who have become victims of the alcohol habit and who are drinking themselves into insanity or the grave. If these cases are taken in time and handled carefully, 35 in each 100 can be cured. The liquor business is one of the most profitable in the country. Profitable to the manufacturers, jobbers, retailers, advertisers, and the government, U.S., which gets $9 per gallon through the tax on whiskey and other high taxes on other liquors, so he got that point across to me. People I know drink. In another letter, I had commented that he was wearing a tie. So he writes, "Dear Elka, your parallel between my necktie and your hairdo is exact. Both are superfluous and therefore wasteful." Had permanent waves then. And being wasteful are antisocial. A necktie, $1.50, probably represents a meal for 50 Korean refugees. We are both miserable sinners for wearing neckties and getting hairdos. In another one, he goes quite thoroughly into what is right and what is lawful and what is not lawful. But let's see if I can find that. No. Under English common law, there are two kinds of wrongs. One, acts that were wrong in themselves, and two, acts that were wrong because they were prohibited by law. Killing a person without provocation was wrong in itself. Going against traffic in a one-way street is wrong because it is prohibited. Let us examine the idea of acts wrong in themselves. You and I live in a world inhabited by others. What is our obligation towards them? To respect their lives. 2, why? Because they and we are here for a purpose. To develop through experience in order that we, as we develop, may be able to create or add to life. 3, if we kill, we subtract from life by destroying it or threatening it. We are therefore in opposition to the universal purpose, which at this point is expanding the universe and not contracting it. 4, in the package of books we sent you the other day, there's a copy of a book that he recommends. And so all his letters are really beautiful that way, that they are teaching but in a very nice way and a very understanding. And so we're really happy to have here 2 speakers who can present other aspects of Scott's life. First is Elliot Coleman, very renowned horticulturalist, agriculturalist, and writer of many books on organic farming. And you'll tell what, a neighbor of Scott and Helen's. And Greg Jolly, who is the head of the Good Life Center, which is the name of the organization now running Scott and Helen's farm and homestead. And he is also has done a great deal of research into Scott and Helen's lives and literature and writings, and has his own press, the Bull Thistle Press. So Elliot, let's start with you.
Thank you. I was very fortunate to have picked up by pure chance living the good life. And I thought a lot of it was absolutely foolish. What do you mean you don't eat peas in December just because they don't grow in December? Haven't you heard of a freezer? But most of it made wonderful sense to me, and so it dragged me right directly into the whole back to the land. I rented a piece of land, started gardening, and the following year went over and met Helen Scott. And then the year after that, we were seriously deciding we were going to do this and leave the teaching job I had, and went over to visit them again and told them we were looking for land. And both Helen and Scott said, well, heck, we're not using the back half of our place, why don't you buy that? And it was the most wonderful real estate discussion that ever took place, because Scott figured it was about 60 acres, and he said it isn't worth more than $10 an acre. And Helen thought that we should pay a little more than that, so we'd actually made some sort of commitment to this. So she thought $2,000 would be a fair price for the 60 acres. And we sat down and calculated on what they'd paid for it 20 years before and added in a 4% cost of living index. And the buyers were offering more than either of the sellers were willing to take. So we compromised on Helen's price, which came out to be $33 an acre. And I have since sold 3 pieces of that to friends for the same $33 an acre because I thought it was a gift that I should share with other people. And the last time was about 20 years ago. There was a 3-acre piece on the corner that wasn't integral to the farm, and I cut it off, and so that comes to $99. And these friends went to the lawyer to get the deed done, and the lawyer said, well, this will be the first time in my career that my fee for a deed is more than the cost of the land. And all of us delight in making lawyers feel like scum, so it was worth doing. Anyway, we moved in, we built a house, and for the first 3 years there, while I was clearing land to get the vegetable farm going, I used to work part-time with Scott and Helen, and a lot of it was building the stone wall around their garden. And for Scott, this was what he referred to as his golf game, and it was just delightfully fun because he had a New York City newsboys apron that said Wall Street Journal, in which he kept his nails for hammering the flag forms together. But he and Helen were both parsimonious enough that Scott used to delight in how little cement he could get away putting in the mix. And they used to get the sand for free by going down to the beach and letting it sit for a while so the rain would wash any salt out. Well, the parsimoniousness caught up with them because about half of the stone wall around the garden has fallen down. But it was fun to build with them. Helen was the one who came along afterwards and put the concrete between the beautiful stones that were held in by the flag forms. They were great fans of creosote and used engine oil. And any wood on the place was done in creosote, and the back of Scott's pickup truck, he'd always save the engine oil when he changed his oil, and he would paint it on there to keep it from rusting. When you think about it, it's a pretty good idea. But there were people who thought this was very amusing, and there was a satire journal that came out in Maine, sometime in, I guess, the mid-'70s, and it was called Ahem. And they decided they wanted to spoof the Nearings. And the Nearings in this satire article became Not and Ellen Sneering, which the satire people just loved this. And they had Helen serving creosote soup, which the way they loved creosote, it probably wasn't far from the truth. But working with Scott, it was just amazing. I mean, when I first met him, he was 83, so he was well on in years. And he wanted to build a new woodshed, and I was working in the woods with him, cutting cedar logs and hauling them out. And it'd be the end of the day. I'd put in part-time up on my farm and then come down and work part-time with them. And I was a little tired, and we were hauling this cedar log out. And I said to myself, wait a minute, boy, buck up. There's an 87-year-old man under the other end of this log. And I was like, I feel tired. So that was enough to keep me going. And then they wanted to build the new house when they decided to sell the house they bought and build a final stone house. I was there with Scott the very first day. They were going to start clearing the site. And it was great. We were up at the old house, got the wheelbarrows, put in little hand saws and axes, any tools we'd need, and trundled down the road to where the driveway, they were just starting with the driveway, was going into the new house. And Scott walked over with a little bow saw to the first tree, bent down, cut it off, looked at it, figured there was at least 1 foot of potential firewood in there, laid it on his wheelbarrow, cut that off into the wheelbarrow, and dragged the brush across the road where there was a wonderful slope that they just put the brush in to get rid of it. And I'm standing there. This man is 50 years my senior, and I'm thinking, my God, man, get real. You're 90 years old. You're starting the driveway. You're even starting the house yet. Let's get some chainsaws in here. Let's get a bulldozer in. what the experience made you realize was that Scott wasn't after the goal. Scott was after the process. Scott delighted in the process. And the process was you had to cut down the trees before you could put the driveway in, before you could get the land ready to build the house. And if Scott had died tomorrow, that was fine. He was happy with the process. He wasn't thinking, oh my God, I got to get the house done. And it was really a wonderful lesson to learn at that young age, that if you enjoyed the process, that was the most important part of it. Scott also, that his garden, the reason we were building a stone wall around it was he said he'd like to know where nature ended and where his garden ended and nature began. And it was hard to do that with a wire fence because it had holes in it. And he was putting up a solid fence between them. And I learned just wonderful stories talking to him. He said that after the First World War, which killed an awful lot of people, and we would have, when we're working, we're always discussing politics and things like that. In fact, working with Scott, eating dinner with Scott was like the best history course you ever took in college, because you had a brilliant professor talking about all these things. But he was commenting on how the colonial powers were really trying to cut everybody else out of the market of trading goods in the First World War by capturing it all for himself. And he said that someone had put together a different version of The Walrus and the Carpenter by Lewis Carroll. And he used to recite this to me. If you all remember, The Walrus and the Carpenter, they go walking with a bunch of oysters down the beach. And then the last verse in the poem is, after they've eaten them, "Oh, oysters," said the carpenter, "you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again?" But answer came there none. And this was scarcely odd, because they'd eaten every one. And the version that came out in the British papers shortly after World War I was the attempt by all the participants in that war to start trading again. "Oh, customers," the merchants said, "we've had our little fun. Shall we begin to trade again?" But answer came there none. And this was scarcely odd, because they killed them, every one. So he had just endless little things like that in his mind. He said that the perfect product for the industrial world, his definition of it was something that costs them a dime, they can sell for $1, wears out quickly, and leaves a habit behind. And that describes chemical fertilizers, drugs, almost anything else you can think of. I just wrote some of these things down because it's just wonderful stories. Another one was Scott was able to get to China probably long before Nixon made it legal. And he had to fly back through Russia. And so he'd been in China, and he gets on this Aeroflot flight back to Russia. This is probably in the 50s, something like the early 50s. And he gets on board, and there are all these Russian executives in three-piece suits, overweight, sitting in the comfortable chairs in the Aeroflot plane, and the stewardess is coming down the aisle passing out vodka martinis. And Scott, the man next to him, spoke English, and Scott said he just sort of offhandedly suggested to the man that the revolution in Russia that he'd been aware of, but had no resemblance to the leaders wearing three-piece suits and drinking vodka martinis. And the man turned to him, held up his vodka martini as if he was toasting him, and he said to him in the best capitalist terms, "We are enjoying the dividends of the revolution." I thought that was just a delightful story. And like I say, I heard these all day long. The vegetarian issue was interesting also, because they were acutely aware that it was not always the thing to do. And Scott remembered they had been invited to Albania. He was great. He was really high on Albania. And they were being feted as these important Americans had been brought in. And so before dinner, they were offered some snacks. And no, we don't eat those. And then dinner, there was a roast something or other. And no, we don't eat meat. And then after dinner, there was coffee or slivovitz or something. No, we don't. And they were painfully aware that that was exactly the wrong thing to do in trying to make friends with people in a country whose politics they enjoyed. But they still, I don't know, I don't think he ever said he felt bad about it, but he was aware of how difficult that made it. They also sold land, and I guess, yes, Scott was about 90 at that point, another piece of land to a young couple. And it had a bunch of nice yellow birches on it. And I was talking to Helen, she said, well, Scotto, it was great to hear this famous man, Scotto, isn't sure he wants to sell that because he has plans for that yellow birch grove. Now, when a man at 90 has a 10-year plan for what he's doing in the woods, this was really pretty wonderful. And, you know, a man of 90, he was the toughest guy I'd ever seen. You know, we hear about old people breaking hips. I can remember we were going to go up to Bangor to something, and I went down there to pick him up, and it was the middle of the winter, and the porch outside their kitchen door was icy. And we walked out, and Scott slipped and went wham. The type of wham that I think would have broken the hip of even a young person. And he said, darn. He got up. Just not I mean, the man was put together very well. In his barn, and this was another wonderful thing, he had tools, carpentry tools, that he'd gotten from his grandfather. And this was really striking because here was a man born in 1883, long before the world as I knew it even began. And yet these were tools that he'd gotten from his grandfather that he'd carefully taken exceptional care of, drill bits and other carpentry tools. And that was really pretty impressive. They used to hold a summer open house on their lawn in August every summer, probably around his birthday, I think, something like that. And people would come from all over, and Scott would give a talk. And at one of these, one of the people in the audience was Marshall Dodge. And if you ever heard of the records of wonderful old Maine stories told with an old Maine accent called Bert and I, a young man named Marshall Dodge was behind that. And he was a very intelligent, inquisitive type. And at the end of Scott's talk, Scott had been talking about their trips to go visit different places. And Marshall said, Mr. Nearin, you're talking out of one side of your mouth about the simple, back to the land life where you grow your own food and you live simply and very little money. And then you're telling us all these stories about how you're flying around the world and visiting all these people. You know, how do you reconcile these two things? And Scott looked at him and said quietly, young man, have you no inconsistencies in your own life? It's just a great answer at the time. And just one last thing, because it was a wonderful afternoon. Scott loved to mow with a sigh, and because I started mowing with a sigh, and I now mow a lot, and I have lots of sighs, and I love them. But they had meadows next to the house, and they used to cut it and then compost hay for compost for the garden. And a local contractor with a tractor would come in and mow them. And one year his tractor was down and he couldn't make it, and Scott was figuring what he was possibly going to do. And since I had such a passion for size, I had about 12 of them. And we had all sorts of young people helping out on our farm, and they would also help the Nearings. And so I said, Scott, we'll be down here tomorrow afternoon. And there was Scott with his scythe, there was 12 or 13 or 14 of us with scythes, and it was just like everything that you could imagine of the old days of hay, one person after another in line going down the field, and we got the whole thing done in an afternoon. And,
Wow.
but it was just great watching Scott out there, you know, at 80, whatever he was, and all these teenagers and 20-somethings, and he was mowing along with the rest of them at the same speed. And that's a bunch of Scott's stories, and I hope you've enjoyed them.
Yeah.
President Harry S. Truman, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C., 6th August 1945. Your government is no longer mine. From this day onward, our paths diverge. You continue your suicide course, blasting and cursing the world. I turn my hand to the task of helping to build a human society based on cooperation, social justice, and human welfare. When I talk about the Nearings, what I've asked a lot is Scott's writing and Helen's writing still relevant? I think it is. So what I've done tonight is I've chosen a bunch of pieces from Scott's writing, and I want to see how it matches up what's going on in our lives today. This was a piece Scott wrote when he was teaching at the Rand School in 1922. It was a talk given by him in the current history class. And he calls it a clever catchphrase. The Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is a clever catchphrase. One of those combinations of words like preparedness and law and order that make their own arguments and carry the conclusion in the premise. Justice is a word that represents the most exalted ideology. As it passes through the mind of the average American-trained school child, it carries with it all those concepts of just conduct, integrity, rectitude, conformity to moral right, and equitability, dealings between man and man that are supposed to lie at the foundation of an ideal human society. A Department of Justice necessarily implies all these ideas. These are, to be sure, the original definitions of justice, but look a little further in the dictionary, and other phrases present themselves. Quote, the administration of law and the forms and processes attending it. Judicial proceedings. Hence, the word means not only conformity to moral right, but the administration of law, of any law, irrespective of its moral rightness or wrongness. The dictionary goes even further. Justice also means infliction of punishment, legal vengeance on an offender, especially corporal punishment, execution. So that in this sense, the term justice becomes the infliction of heavy bodily penalties. Anybody hear about Mr. Snowden and Private Manning? When the founders of the American government established justices of the peace, justices of the Supreme Court, and the Department of Justice, they had in mind legal administration and punishment. The Department of Justice is an agency for administering some of the law, some of the time. The laws against the opponents of the established order are enforced with savage barbarity. The laws against those who plunder the people and the government may be enforced or they may not. The Department of Justice is a jobbing house, distributing favors, immunities, privileges, and occasionally serving as a bulwark behind which powerful men hide when they commit crime. The department, like any other agency of the vested interests, must be seen realistically as a part of the machinery of the established order. A banker collects interest as a matter of course. A landlord racks rent from even the most poverty-stricken. The Department of Justice, without any reference to morality, equity, rectitude, protects and serves the existing order with a zealous solicitude. 1922. Of course, that was after Scott had gone through his own sedition trial in 1919 for supposedly telling people who might be getting drafted why they were going to go to war in Europe. And he felt that they should understand the reasons why they were going to war. And he felt the reasons why they were going to war was to protect the vested interests who had economic concerns in the war. It was not about making the world safe for democracy or the war to end all wars. So that gives you kind of a feeling for some of Scott's work around that issue. And he also says, those who wish to restrain behavior patterns have gained the result by restricting knowledge. This comes from 1915. We're going back to a book called Anthracite. Scott grew up in a small town in Morris Run, Pennsylvania, which was a coal town. It was a coal mining town. The reason for the failure of regulation lies in the fact that the industries that are subject to regulation often prove to be so much stronger than the government that they can make and modify laws and direct public affairs in their own interest. Their control of the resources gives them a source from which to draw the huge surplus funds that are needed to run an organization in successful opposition to the established government and its rules. 1915. Does he sound out of date? Doesn't to me. This is a speech he gave in Chautauqua in 1916, the summer he lost his job from the University of Pennsylvania, because the trustees didn't like the fact that he was against child labor.